Okay, let's unpack this. We're doing a deep dive today into a period that, well, it feels both distant, historically speaking, and yet kind of unsettlingly close sometimes to our own anxieties.
Mm.
We're looking at the New Deal era, roughly 1932 to 1952, and we're using the lens of the test material you've shared with us.
And it's a really fascinating perspective, this material. It argues that, well, this time wasn't just about tackling the Great Depression here at home.
Right.
It was fundamentally about the survival, the testing, really, of liberal democracy itself
Yeah.
under these global pressures
Hmm.
that created this sense of uncommon uncertainty at a depth that generates fear.
Yeah, that phrase, uncertainty at a depth that generates fear, it really hits home, doesn't it? It captures that atmosphere the source describes. It's not
Yeah.
just like calculable risk,
Exactly.
but something deeper, this dread. So our mission here in this deep dive is to pull out the most important insights from your sources, really get a handle on the defining challenges of this fearful landscape, the surprising compromises made,
Some very surprising ones.
and the lasting structures that came out of it. Let's jump right into that world scored by fear.
Agreed. And the first thing, really, that your source material lays out is just how much liberal democracy felt under siege globally. Back in the 1930s and 40s,
Right.
it was genuinely on the defensive. It was being challenged by what people saw then as the vigor and dynamism of these radical one-party dictatorships, Nazism, fascism, Stalinism.
And the source makes this really striking point that these regimes didn't just grab power, they often actually claimed they were a better, truer kind of democracy.
That's the thing. They weren't rejecting the word democracy. They're completely redefining it.
Wow.
Exactly. You see figures quoted like Giovanni Gentile, who was a key philosopher for fascism, saying the fascist state was the democratic state par excellence. The whole claim was it used the thought and will of the masses through the party, uniting the nation and economy.
And Stalin used similar language, too.
Yeah, talking about raising the activeness and consciousness of the party mass, getting them involved not just in discussion, but in leadership to work. Now, obviously, these weren't democracies as we'd recognize them.
Not at all.
They offered mass mobilization, sure, participation only through approved channels, enforced national unity, promised economic results. But, and this is key, they did it without democratic lawmaking, without any real separation between the state and society. It was a total rejection of liberal norms.
And this huge external challenge wasn't happening in, like, a bubble for the U.S., right?
No, exactly. Your source reminds us that even at home, there were immense domestic pressures. Okay, the U.S. wasn't depicted as being on the verge of joining the democratic collapse.
Right, not quite that bad.
But there was still ongoing economic hardship, massive environmental crisis, the Dust Bowl, persistent racial violence, anti-Semitism was a real thing, major labor unrest, and these loud, disruptive demagogues stirring things up.
So it's that combination, the global threat, plus all this intense domestic strain that creates that profound, uncorrelated uncertainty, what the source calls deep fear.
Yeah, distinct from just everyday risk you can calculate.
And that's the crucial context for understanding the choices the New Deal made, right?
Absolutely. And speaking of choices, this whole context of fear, it led to some, well, really uncomfortable accommodations. The source talks about what it calls the New Deal's complex dance with authoritarianism, highlighting some surprising and ultimately ephemeral partners, temporary ones.
And I think probably the most eyebrow-raising detail here is the discussion of an initial fondness for Italian fascism among some U.S. figures. That just feels so counter to how we usually think about that era. Why was that?
Well, the argument presented is that, to some observers at the time, Mussolini seemed like he'd, quote, saved capitalism in Italy. There was some admiration for the administrative reforms his regime put in place, and this idea of corporatist organization, basically, bringing labor and capital together under state direction as a way to manage the economy. The source points to someone like Hugh Johnson, the guy who headed the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, an early New Deal agency trying to get industry back on its feet.
Yeah, I know the name.
Johnson reportedly handed out fascist pamphlets and even kept a portrait of Mussolini in his office.
Wow. That's a concrete example, all right.
Yeah.
And that Balbo visit in 1933, that detail feels incredible. It wasn't just some quick stopover.
No, not at all.
The source describes this massive welcome in New York, a ticker tape parade, 2 million people. He had lunch with FDR at the White House.
Yeah, he did. and got public praise from high-level folks like the Secretary of the Navy for his leadership. He even met Charles Lindbergh. It
Incredible.
was a pretty big deal. And Balbo, who was Mussolini's air minister, definitely used it for political propaganda. Trying to say anti-fascist feeling abroad was just a myth.
Yeah.
And this detail becomes even more, well, jarring when you read that the source also notes his involvement in the persecution of Jews in Libya, a brutal reality kind of hidden behind that public spectacle.
Okay. And the sources also mentioned the U.S. tolerating Soviet hypocrisy, especially through that figure, Iola Nikitchenko, the Soviet judge at Nuremberg.
Yeah, his background is, frankly, chilling. He'd overseen show trials during Stalin's purges.
Wow.
Yes, the source even includes this really chilling quote from Nikita Khrushchev about supporting those verdicts back then, saying they needed to march across the corpses of the enemy. Just brutal.
And yet he's at Nuremberg.
Yet, according to this analysis, Nikitchenko sat on the bench at Nuremberg, played a key role in pushing Stalin's agenda for retribution. He even objected when German defendants tried to bring up evidence that contradicted the Soviet story, like, who was really responsible for the Katyn massacre.
And what happened to him later? The source mentioned something.
Yeah, his fate later being cast into the wilderness by Stalin, because he didn't get the exact percentage of death sentences Stalin wanted. It just underscores the total ruthlessness of that regime, even to its own people.
Right.
So these details are in there to make the point that these partnerships, however deeply uncomfortable they look from a liberal democratic viewpoint, were based on what the source calls instrumental realism. They're seen as strategically necessary, especially for building that united front against fascism during the war.
Okay. A means to an end.
Pretty much.
Uh-huh.
But they were also ephemeral, temporary tactical alliances, not based on any shared values. And making these decisions required the U.S. to compromise on the very norms, tolerance, due process, basic rights that liberal democracy claimed to champion. It really shows the tough choices fear forced on them.
Okay, so those were the temporary, maybe pragmatic, but definitely problematic alliances the source talks about. But then the analysis shifts, right? It discusses another far more enduring partner.
Yes, and in the source's words, a defining partner for the New Deal, the Jim Crow South.
And this part really emphasizes how unique the South was during this time.
Absolutely. It wasn't just a region with different politics. The source describes it as having a hardwired racial hierarchy. African Americans were legally and often violently excluded from civic life, from being part of the body politic.
The numbers are pretty stark, too.
They really are. No more than 4% of black Americans could vote as late as 1938. Just think about that.
And that voting data comparison you mentioned, Mississippi versus California in 38.
Yeah, it's powerful. It shows just how restricted the vote was. A winning candidate in a Mississippi district might get just a few thousand votes.
Wow.
While in California, you're talking tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000. In some Mississippi districts, the source says, for every one voter, there were 25 in a contested California district. It just paints a picture of a very limited electorate and a totally dominant one-party system.
And that small electorate translated into huge power in Washington.
Directly. Representatives from those 17 states that legally mandated segregation, they weren't marginal figures. They were pivotal members of the House and Senate. The source calls them the most important veto players in American politics at the time.
So what did that mean, having these veto players right at the center?
Well, according to the source, their influence profoundly affected both the actual content of New Deal policies and, quote, its moral tenor. They basically narrowed the field of what was even possible policy-wise to things that they would approve.
Okay.
The analysis states it pretty bluntly. No noteworthy lawmaking could have passed without their consent.
And you can see this playing out in specific fights, right? Like the lack of a big federal push on civil rights from FDR.
Exactly. And his staff included Southerners like James Burns and Stephen Early. The Justice Department, at least initially, largely looked the other way on issues of racial violence and disenfranchisement.
And the anti-lynching bill debates?
Oh, yeah, classic example. Southern opposition filibustered the bill. Senators threatened to speak night and day. Their arguments were all about states' rights, our handling of our race problems. Southern Democrats accused Northern Democrats who supported the bill of just pandering to black voters in cities like Harlem, saying it was a bill to make Harlem safe for Tammany.
So a real internal party fight.
Huge. And the source notes how close some of those votes were and how Southern Democrats saw Northern support for things like that as a real betrayal of the Democratic Party's, well, historical base.
What about the Fair Labor Standards Act? The FLSA, minimum wage and hours, that ran into trouble too.
It did. Southern lawmakers were really hesitant. Why? Because labor organization could potentially challenge the racial hierarchies and their power structures.
Oh, okay.
So they successfully pushed for major exemptions for farm workers, for seafood processing workers sectors where black labor was heavily concentrated, effectively shutting many black workers out from the law's protections.
So the law passed, but with big holes punched in it by the South.
Exactly. And the source points to a really close vote that almost killed the bill entirely as a sign of things to come. A harbinger, it says, of more opposition to federal labor rules driven by these Southern concerns.
And even during World War II, something like the soldier voting bill shows this same dynamic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You had Southern politicians, Senators Byrd, Overton, O'Daniel, Bilbo, strongly fighting a federal role in soldier voting. They were afraid it was an opening wedge,
A wedge for what?
something that could eventually be used to attack the poll tax system that kept black voters away from the polls back home.
Mm-hmm.
And the source highlights how the language the Southern Democrats used in those debates became almost interchangeable with conservative Republicans like Senator Robert Taft. They were both against federal control, especially when it might even indirectly threaten the Southern racial system.
So the core point here, the dynamic the source identifies, is that unlike those temporary deals with dictators, the Jim Crow South was the one collaborator America's democracy could not do without. This alliance wasn't just convenient. It was, in this analysis, essential and permanent if you wanted to get any major legislation through Congress.
Which brings us to another huge transforming force of the era, World War II itself, the crucible of total war, and how it leads to the birth of the national security state.
Okay.
World War II, as your sources describe it, was absolute war.
Meaning, what does that mean exactly?
It means violence without the usual limits, unrestricted targeting, massive civilian casualties. The source gives examples we know, like the bombing of Rotterdam, Coventry, London, just devastating urban centers.
Right.
And just horrifyingly, the scale of the Nazi extermination campaigns,
Right.
including what the source calls the forgotten Holocaust, the mass shootings by the Einsatzgruppen, like the massacre of Babi Yar. Unbelievable numbers.
And the human cost overall, especially for the Soviets.
Immense. Their military and civilian losses just dwarf those of the U.S. and Britain. And it's also pointed out, significantly, that unlike other major powers, the war itself never actually reached the North American mainland. The fighting was elsewhere.
Okay, so this context of absolute war had big effects back home, too.
Profound domestic consequences.
Yeah.
Your source notes that common observation, captured in a New York Times quote at the time, that a state of war just lifts the limit from presidential powers.
Right.
And FDR himself made really explicit claims of prerogative, his right to act. He even threatened to act without Congress if needed, citing the urgent crisis.
And this is also when we see the beginnings of what we now call the internal security state.
Yes, the very origins. The source details how the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, back in 1936, asked for permission to start monitoring subversive activities.
That early.
That early. And it led to these FBI surveillance programs targeting not just potential foreign agents, but industries, unions, institutions, often using methods outside the Constitution, like wiretaps and reading mail without warrants. And then you have the Smith Act in 1940. It required aliens to register, but it also had provisions against advocating for overthrowing the government.
And that was used.
How? Well, the source mentions its first use was actually against Trotskyists in Minneapolis. But it notes its later, more famous use against communists. It shows how the definition of internal threat could shift depending on who the enemy was perceived to be.
And it's particularly revealing how these internal security concerns specifically targeted African Americans.
Yes, the source highlights an FBI survey from the time. Alongside looking into Japanese influence or the Communist Party, it explicitly focused on the NAACP and the black press.
Why them?
Well, it was often framed in the context of racial tensions, like the 1943 Harlem Riot. It shows how existing racial anxieties got woven right into the fabric of this new security apparatus that was being built.
And the war also fueled the growth of the military-industrial complex, or its precursor.
Military-industrial science complex, yeah. The source describes these wartime economic agencies and how the lines just blurred between civilian government, the military, corporations, and universities.
And the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development, led by Vannevar Bush, is key here.
Very key. It used this contracting model. Basically, it farmed out research projects to universities and private companies. Harvard working on explosives, MIT on radar. It fundamentally changed the relationships between government, the military, academia, and industry. A whole new way of doing things.
And your source includes a warning about this, right?
Yeah.
It's from the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, a really powerful historical reminder. It quotes Federalist Paper number 8, which argued way back then that safety from external danger often compels nations, even those most attached to liberty, to create institutions that could eventually destroy their civil and political rights.
Wow.
It's that profound tension, isn't it, between the need for security and protecting civil liberties. And that tension was incredibly sharp during this fearful wartime period.
Which takes us right into the post-war years. Point 5 in the outline, post-war anxieties and reshaping American capitalism. So initially, right after the war, there's some hope.
Yeah, definitely a sense of hope, a feeling that reconstruction was possible, that liberal democracy had won globally, and maybe things could get back to, well, not normal, but a better path.
But that hope faded pretty fast.
It collided hard with new realities.
Yeah.
The source of fear just shifted dramatically. Now, it was the atomic age. The Trinity test, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the bomb, it introduced this entirely new level of existential dread.
Yeah.
The source even quotes Oppenheimer himself, reflecting on how the U.S. monopoly on the bomb was rapidly melting away and the danger this posed to civilized life.
And this fear merges right into the Cold War starting up so quickly.
Exactly. Henry Stimson framed it as a real war for survival, and that became the rationale for massive rearmament, laid out in documents like NSC 68.
NSC 68, that was important.
Crucial. A really hard-hitting, stern analysis, the source calls it. It basically said the U.S. and Soviet systems were fundamentally incompatible, couldn't coexist peacefully long-term. And it called for a huge increase in defense spending, troop levels. It explicitly stated, the Cold War is in fact a real war in which the survival of the free world is at stake. Stark terms.
So against this backdrop of global, now nuclear fear, there's also this big domestic debate about peacetime capitalism, like what happens now?
Yes, exactly. What's the role of labor unions, for instance? They'd gained a lot of strength under the Wagner Act during the New Deal.
Mm-hmm.
And the source notes a clear shift away from those earlier models of centralized planning or corporatist organization, the kind you saw in the early NRA or the wartime agencies.
So what was the alternative?
The focus moved more towards reestablishing traditional market dynamics, competition, but importantly with a stronger federal fiscal role, government spending and taxing.
And this led to pushback against unions, constraints on labor.
Big time. Most significantly with the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947.
Right.
The source details this intense fight against unions, and it highlights again that pivotal role of the Southern Democratic and Republican alliance in getting this legislation through.
Same alliance as before.
Pretty much the same key figures. Senator Taft, alongside Southern senators like Eastland, Byrd, Overton, O'Daniel, Bilbo. And in the House, guys like Howard Smith, Hatton Sumpters, Ezekiel Gathings, Robert Doughton, they were instrumental.
And their motivations were?
Well, a deep-seated fear of expanding federal power, for one, and crucially for the Southerners, the potential implications for racial integration. Always that underlying concern.
How so with Taft-Hartley?
The source quotes Congressman Gathings arguing against returning federal employment offices to state control because it would let the Secretary of Labor ensure equal referral opportunities. He feared it would create a modified but nevertheless effective FEPC, a Fair Employment Practices Committee.
Which was strongly opposed in the South.
Exactly. So passing Taft-Hartley, which significantly curbed union power, required this Southern cohesion with Republicans. And it led directly to the rise of state right-to-work laws, further weakening unions.
So the outcome for economic policy was?
Well, it leaned heavily on fiscal policy, federal spending, taxation, managed by the Bureau of the Budget, the BOB, influenced by Keynesian ideas rather than that centralized planning approach. Unions were constrained.
Mm.
And the source argues this decline of corporatist ideas led to the rise of a pluralist model of democracy.
Pluralist model. Meaning?
Meaning, political life is seen primarily as a competition between different interest groups, business, labor, agriculture, etc., rather than a search for some single unified common good.
Okay.
The sources cite political scientists like Robert Dahl talking about the American hybrid system and David Truman explicitly saying a national public interest didn't really exist, just the outcomes of this group competition.
Which brings us to the last section here, looking at the lingering shadows. Security and compromise. So the pressure for internal security didn't just vanish after the war.
No, if anything, it intensified. The source notes continued pressure from Congress investigations, hearings often fueled by these new Cold War anxieties. And the analysis argues these processes were often designed, really, to confirm the premise that there was a fifth column inside America. It blurred the lines between legitimate political dissent and actual disloyalty to the democratic state.
And the Oppenheimer security clearance case comes up again here as an example.
Yes, presented as a particularly stark illustration of how established due process norms could just be thrown out the window.
What kind of violations?
Well, the source points out things like the FBI monitoring conversations between Oppenheimer and his lawyers,
Wow.
and then sharing that information with the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, Louis Strauss, basically letting the prosecution know the defense strategy in advance. It just shows how security concerns could override fundamental rights, even for someone as distinguished as Oppenheimer.
And even when President Truman tried to push back, like with the McCarran Act in 1950,
He did veto it. He argued it represented dangerous thought control. But Congress overrode his veto.
they did.
Yeah. And that act established significant requirements for Communist Action and Communist Front organizations to register with the government. It just underscores how deeply these security anxieties have become embedded in the political system by then, leading to measures that, in the analysis presented, definitely sacrifice some civil liberties in the name of perceived safety.
So let's try and bring this all together. The New Deal era, as explored in this material we've been discussing, was just fundamentally defined by intense, pervasive fear.
Yeah, from so many directions. Economic collapse, rising dictatorships, then total war, the atomic bomb of the Cold War.
Liberal democracy wasn't just like evolving calmly. It was fighting for its life, really.
Absolutely. And in navigating that incredibly difficult landscape, the U.S. made compromises, huge ones. It formed those temporary, pragmatic, but deeply uncomfortable alliances with regimes like fascist Italy and Stalinist Russia, driven by what the source calls instrumental realism.
Strategic necessity, basically.
Right. But its most essential and permanent collaborator, the analysis argues pretty strongly, was the white supremacist Jim Crow South. The veto power held by Southern politicians in Congress just profoundly shaped the content and even the possibility of New Deal legislation. It blocked advancements in civil rights, constrained labor, leaving this long, difficult legacy we're still dealing with.
And the experience of total war also dramatically expanded presidential power.
Yeah, and laid the groundwork for the elements of a national security state.
Right.
It blurred those lines between government, military, corporations, universities. And sometimes definitely sacrificed civil liberties for perceived security, highlighting that core tension.
Right. Safety versus rights.
And the post-war period saw American capitalism reshaped unions constrained, a shift towards that pluralist model of democracy focused on interest group competition, maybe less on a unified public interest.
So the core argument from the source is that even without changing the Constitution on paper, the New Deal effectively created a kind of second republic.
That's the term used, yeah. A
Yeah.
new national state with a fundamentally different scope, a different style of governing authority compared to what existed before, say, 1932. And it was forged in this crucible of fear and compromise.
And the world that Second Republic made, its structures, its compromises, its unresolved tensions, it continues, the source argues, to demand thoughtful choices from us in our world, which, as the source points out, is still scored by fear, just maybe in different ways.
Yes, exactly. Understanding this history, the nature of the threats they faced then, the compromises they made in response, the lasting impact of alliances like the one with the Jim Crow South, the rise of the security state, it gives us really crucial context for understanding the structures and the dilemmas we're still navigating today. It helps you see how the past kind of shaped the boundaries of what feels possible now.
So, here's a provocative thought for you, our listener, to ponder as you continue your own deep dives into the world around you. This comes right from the heart of this analysis. How do societies balance that need for security, confronting threats, both external and internal, with the absolute preservation of fundamental civil liberties and democratic norms? The choices made back in that fearful era defined the boundaries of what they thought was possible then. What are the lingering effects of those choices, and how do they inform the choices we have to make today about fear, power, and the health of our own democracy?